The morning of May 13, 1949, broke grey and uncertain over Warton Aerodrome in Lancashire. A small crowd of engineers and test pilots gathered on the apron, watching as a sleek twin-engine aircraft was wheeled out of its hangar. It looked unlike anything that had flown before from a British factory. The wings were enormous and broad, almost gull-like in their proportions. The fuselage was clean and slim, untroubled by gun turrets or defensive armament. The two jet engines were buried close to the fuselage in elegant nacelles. The aircraft had no name yet, only a designation, a 1, the first prototype of what English Electric would soon call the Canberra. Her serial number was VN799. There was a moment of hesitation among the senior engineers that morning. The date was a Friday, and it was the 13th of the month. Teddy Petter, the chief designer, offered to delay the maiden flight by a day. The man at the controls would not hear of it. He was English Electric's chief test pilot, the former wing commander Roland Beamont. He had led No. 150 Wing during the Vosne campaign and the autumn fighting over the Low Countries and the Reich, before being brought down by flak near Bocholt on the 12th of October, 1944, on his 492nd operational sortie. He had spent the rest of the war as a prisoner. He understood jet aircraft as well as any man alive, having wrestled with the early Gloucester Meteor in the months after his repatriation. Beamont later recalled his reply to Petter that morning. "If the aeroplane is fit to fly, then I will fly it on that day." When he opened the throttles on the two Rolls-Royce Avon engines and released the brakes, the prototype leapt forward with an acceleration that astonished everyone watching. Within a few hundred yards, she was airborne. Climbing through 15,000 feet at a rate no British bomber had ever achieved, she carved a clean arc over the Lancashire coast. Beamont brought her back to Warton approximately 27 minutes after takeoff. He climbed out and walked over to the engineers waiting by the hangar. He could not possibly have known how right his confidence had been. What he had just flown would remain in frontline operational service somewhere in the world until July 31, 2006. 57 years of continuous service, through the entire Cold War from beginning to end. Through Korea, through Suez, through Vietnam, through the Falklands, through the Gulf, through Bosnia, through Afghanistan. By the time the last Royal Air Force Canberra ferried herself to Kemble for preservation, the children of her original test pilots had themselves grown old, and the Soviet Union itself had ceased to exist. To this day, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration retains rebuilt Canberras at Ellington Field in Houston, Texas, capable of gathering data above 60,000 feet. The basic design is now 77 years old and still on the active inventory. This is the story of how a single aircraft, designed in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War, outlived nearly every contemporary, defied a dozen replacements, and became the longest-serving combat jet in Royal Air Force history. It is also the story of why she was so often dismissed as obsolete, ancient, a relic of a vanished age, and why those dismissals were always wrong. To understand the Canberra, one must first understand the world that produced her. In 1944, with the war in Europe still raging, the British Air Ministry began thinking about what would come next. Piston engine bombers had reached the limits of their development. The German jets appearing over the Reich, the Messerschmitt 262 and the Arado 234, demonstrated that the future of military aviation belonged to the turbine engine. Britain had her own jet program advancing rapidly. The question was, what kind of jet bombers the Royal Air Force would need in the post-war world. The specification that emerged, designated B3/45, called for something genuinely revolutionary. The new aircraft was to be a high-altitude, high-speed bomber capable of reaching any target in Europe from bases in Britain. She would carry a substantial bomb load. She would fly higher than any existing fighter could intercept. And critically, she would dispense entirely with defensive armament. No gun turrets, no tail guns, no belly position. The aircraft would rely on speed and altitude alone to escape interception. This was a radical departure from every bomber tradition. Throughout the Second World War, heavy bombers had bristled with machine guns, accepting the weight and drag penalties as the price of survival against fighter attack. The Avro Lancaster carried 8 guns. The Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress carried 13. To propose a bomber with no guns at all seemed almost reckless. Surely some clever fighter would always find a way to climb higher or fly faster. The man who believed otherwise was William Edward Willoughby Petter, known throughout the British aircraft industry as Teddy Petter. Petter was the chief designer at English Electric, a company better known for railway locomotives and electrical equipment than for original aircraft design. He had previously designed the Westland Lysander, the Westland Whirlwind, and the high-altitude Welkin, and he was widely regarded as one of the most original aerodynamic minds in Britain. When English Electric won the contract to develop the new bomber, Petter assembled a small team in a converted building, known affectionately as the Garage, on Corporation Street, Preston, and began work. His design philosophy was austere and beautiful. The aircraft would be aerodynamically clean to an extraordinary degree, with wings large and broad, generating tremendous lift at high altitude where the air was thin. The engines would be the new Rolls-Royce Avon turbojets, the most powerful jets in British development. The crew would be small. The original specification called for just 2 men, a pilot and a navigator using radar. When the radar was delayed, the design grew to accommodate a 3rd crewman, a visual bomb aimer in a glazed nose. Everything that did not contribute to performance would be ruthlessly excluded. The result, when she flew that grey May morning in 1949, was an aircraft that seemed to belong to a different decade than the Lancasters and Lincolns still equipping Bomber Command. The Canberra could climb to 48,000 feet, far above the operational ceiling of any contemporary fighter. She cruised at 450 knots, carried up to 10,000 pounds of bombs over a combat radius of more than 800 miles, and had no defensive armament whatsoever. There was nothing in the sky that could catch her. The first production, Canberra B Mark II, entered service with No. 101 Squadron at Royal Air Force Binbrook on May 25, 1951. Beamont himself delivered the first aircraft, performing a 5-minute display before landing. Within 2 years, more than 20 squadrons were operating the type. The Canberra had transformed Bomber Command from a piston-engine relic of the Second World War into the most modern strike force in Western Europe. Petter did not see this triumph from inside the company. He had resigned from English Electric in February 1950, more than a year before his aircraft entered squadron service. After disagreements with management over the structure of the firm's aircraft division, he moved to Folland Aircraft to begin work on what would become the Nat. The Canberra was carried through to maturity by his deputy, Frederick Page, who would later design Britain's first Mach II fighter, the Lightning. Petter walked out a year before his masterpiece flew. It is a quietly poignant detail in a story otherwise full of triumph. Then something happened that no one had predicted. The Americans came to buy her. This was almost without precedent. Since the early days of military aviation, the flow of aircraft technology had moved overwhelmingly from west to east across the Atlantic. American manufacturers built aircraft that the rest of the world purchased or license-built. The idea that the United States Air Force would adopt a British combat aircraft as its standard tactical bomber was almost unthinkable, yet that is exactly what happened. The sequence was extraordinary. On February 21, 1951, squadron leader Arthur Callard flew a Canberra B Mark II from Aldergrove to Gander in 4 hours, 37 minutes, becoming the first jet aircraft ever to cross the Atlantic non-stop without refueling. 5 days later, on February 26, that same aircraft entered a fly-off competition at Andrews Air Force Base. The Canberra was tested against the Martin X B-51, the North American B-45 Tornado, the Avro Canada CF-100, and the North American AJ-1 Savage. A British bomber, hand-flown across the ocean by a single crew, beat 4 American designs on their home airfield in less than a week. The combination of altitude, speed, range, and handling was simply superior to every American aircraft then available. The Air Force placed an order with the Glenn L. Martin Company at Middle River, Maryland, to build the Canberra under license as the B-57. Eventually, 403 Martin B-57s would be constructed, serving in roles ranging from tactical bombing to electronic reconnaissance. American crews flew Canberras over Vietnam. American test pilots flew them on the edge of space. The aircraft that had been designed in a converted building on Corporation Street, Preston, had become a frontline asset of the most powerful air force in the world. By the mid-1950s, the Canberra was being built or operated in numbers across the Western Alliance. Australia took delivery of her own license-built version, 48 Mark XX aircraft, constructed by the government aircraft factories at Avalon and Fisherman's Bend in Victoria. The Royal Australian Air Force would fly Canberras on combat operations over Malaya and Vietnam. The aircraft had been deliberately named after the Australian capital by English Electric chairman Sir George Nelson as a sales tactic to woo the Royal Australian Air Force as the first export customer. The strategy worked. India ordered substantial numbers and would use them in 2 wars against Pakistan. South Africa, New Zealand, Rhodesia, Sweden, Venezuela, Peru, Ecuador, Argentina, Chile, and several other nations all eventually operated the type. Pakistan flew the American-built Martin B-57 version. The Canberra became, in the most literal sense, a global aircraft. She was also a record breaker. On May 4, 1953, test pilot Wally Gibb took a Canberra fitted with experimental Bristol Olympus engines to 63,668 feet, an absolute world altitude record. He raised it again to 65,889 feet on August 29, 1955. Then on August 28, 1957, Mike Randrup of Napier took a B Mark II with serial WK163 to 70,310 feet, climbing out from Luton on a Napier double Scorpion liquid fuel rocket motor mounted in the bomb bay. The crew wore partially pressurized helmets. The Canberra now held 3 absolute world altitude records. Earlier the same decade, on October 9, 1953, Flight Lieutenant Roland Burton had won the speed section of the London to Christchurch air race in Canberra, PR 3WE139, covering 12,270 statute miles in 23 hours, 50 minutes, and 42 seconds. That record still stands. By 1958, the type held 22 world records of various kinds. Remarkably, WK163 itself still survives, owned today by the Vulcan to the Sky Trust and undergoing restoration to flight. And yet, almost from the moment of these triumphs, the dismissals began. Soviet air defense technology was advancing rapidly. New surface-to-air missiles, the SA-2 guideline in particular, threatened any aircraft that ventured into hostile airspace at high altitude. New Soviet fighters, the MiG-19 and soon the MiG-21, could climb to altitudes that had once been the Canberra's exclusive domain. Western strategists began arguing that the era of the high-altitude bomber was ending. The future, they said, belonged to supersonic aircraft flying at low level beneath enemy radar coverage. The Canberra, with her subsonic cruise speed and her preference for high altitude, was already obsolete. The first surface-to-air missile kill in aviation history confirmed those fears. On October 7, 1959, a Republic of China Air Force RB-57D, the high-altitude reconnaissance variant of the Canberra, was shot down by an S-75 missile over Tongxian, China. The pilot, Captain Wang Yingqin, did not survive. Investigators counted 2,471 shrapnel holes in the wreckage. This was 7 months before Gary Powers and his U-2 were brought down over Sverdlovsk. The age of the impregnable high flyer was visibly ending. The Royal Air Force began planning the Canberra's replacement almost immediately. Between 1960 and 1980, it would attempt to do so at least 5 times. The Avro 730 died in the 1957 Defence White Paper. The British Aircraft Corporation TSR-2 was cancelled by Cabinet on April 1, 1965. The Anglo-French variable geometry program collapsed in June 1967 when France withdrew. The F-111 order was cancelled in January 1968, following the November sterling devaluation. Every replacement program was delayed, troubled, cancelled, or only partially successful, and the supposedly obsolete Canberra simply outlasted them all. She kept flying through the introduction of the Buccaneer, the Phantom, and finally the Tornado. Each of her supposed successors arrived late, arrived diminished, or never arrived at all. To understand why, it is necessary to look closely at what the Canberra actually was and at the engineering philosophy that produced her. The heart of the matter lay in her wing. Petter had designed the Canberra around a wing of extraordinary area, 960 square feet, with a modest aspect ratio that produced very low wing loading. Her weight was spread across an enormous lifting surface. Low wing loading produces specific advantages. The aircraft can fly slowly without stalling, turn tightly without losing energy, and operate from short runways. Most critically, she could climb to extreme altitudes, because that great wing continued to generate lift in air so thin that smaller wings would simply stop working. Most jet bombers of the 1950s were designed for high speed, with small swept wings optimized for transonic flight. They were fast at medium altitude, but they could not climb very high, they could not loiter, and they could not operate from rough airfields. The Canberra could do all three. Her broad, straight wing made her a poor candidate for supersonic flight, and she would never be supersonic, but it made her supremely capable at the tasks she was actually asked to perform. The Rolls-Royce Avon, in its various developing marks, was one of the great jet engines of the early Cold War, and the Canberra was the perfect airframe to exploit it. Reliable, powerful, and economical, the Avon gave her a thrust-to-weight ratio that compared favourably with much later aircraft. Performance simply did not degrade with age, because the underlying physics of her wing and her engines did not change. A Canberra in 1975 performed almost identically to a Canberra in 1955. She had also been built to last. Petter and his team designed the airframe with substantial wing spars and a robust fuselage, built to absorb stress without complaint. When the Royal Air Force began converting Canberras for low-level flight in the early 1960s, in response to the changing threat environment, the airframes simply absorbed the new role without difficulty. Other aircraft of the period, designed for narrower performance envelopes, suffered structural fatigue when their roles changed. Above all, the Canberra was versatile. The basic bomber became a photographic reconnaissance platform, the Canberra PR-3 and later the celebrated PR-9. She became an electronic intelligence platform, gathering signals from Soviet radars across Eastern Europe. She became a target tug, a trainer, a pathfinder, an electronic warfare aircraft, and a high-altitude research aircraft. The Americans converted theirs into the WB-57 for atmospheric sampling, a role that some examples continue to perform for the National Aeronautics and Space Administration to this day. While the Canberra was quietly proving herself indispensable, the world's other aircraft manufacturers were demonstrating the opposite lesson. The early Cold War produced an extraordinary number of jet bombers and tactical aircraft, most of which served briefly and were forgotten. The Americans had built the Boeing B-47 Stratojet, a beautiful and revolutionary aircraft that was the first true swept-wing jet bomber. The B-47 entered service in 1951, the same year as the Canberra. By 1966, just 15 years later, the last B-47 had been retired from operational bombing service. The aircraft had proven structurally fragile under the stresses of low-level flight, and her narrow operational envelope had been overtaken by changing requirements. She was gone within a generation. The Soviet Ilyushin Il-28 Beagle, the closest direct equivalent to the Canberra, lacked her altitude performance, her range, and her adaptability, and most had been retired from frontline service by the late 1970s. The French Sud Aviation Vautour, entering service in 1958, was retired by France in 1979, an unremarkable 21-year career. The Douglas B-66 destroyer served from 1956 to the early 1970s, with electronic warfare variants flying combat in Vietnam before retirement around 1973. Even those derivatives were gone before the Canberra had reached the midpoint of her operational career. The pattern was consistent. Jet bombers of the early Cold War tended to serve for 15, 20, perhaps 25 years at the outside. The Canberra simply did not follow this pattern. She kept finding new missions, kept proving useful in environments her designers had never imagined. In 1956, less than 7 years after her first flight, the Canberra went to war for the first time. The Suez Crisis erupted when Egypt nationalized the Suez Canal, and Britain and France launched military operations to recover it. Royal Air Force Canberras, flying from Nicosia in Cyprus and from Lucca and Hal Far in Malta, struck Egyptian airfields and military installations as part of Operation Musketeer between October 31 and November 6, 1956. 12 Egyptian airfields were attacked. The aircraft performed almost exactly as designed, dropping bombs from medium altitude with reasonable accuracy and returning unscathed in nearly every case. Egyptian air defences could not effectively engage the high-flying bombers. The only Canberra lost in the campaign was a PR-7 from Akrotiri, on detachment to No. 13 Squadron, shot down on November 6 by a Syrian Gloucester Meteor, killing the navigator Flying Officer Geoffrey Urquhart Pullen. The Suez operation was a political disaster for Britain, but the Canberra herself emerged from her combat debut with her reputation enhanced. The Royal Australian Air Force took her own Canberras to Vietnam in 1967. No. 2 Squadron, operating from Phan Rang Air Base, flew bombing missions over South Vietnam in support of Allied ground forces from April 1967 until June 1971. Over 4 years, Australian Canberras flew more than 11,900 combat sorties and dropped 76,389 bombs, totaling 27,158 tons. Despite flying only 5% of the sorties of the host wing, No. 2 Squadron accounted for 16% of the wing's bomb damage assessment. The squadron lost only 2 aircraft. A-84-231 disappeared on a night mission on November 3, 1970. The wreckage was finally found in Vietnam in 2009. A-84-228 was shot down by a surface-to-air missile west of Hue on March 14, 1971. Both crew ejected and were rescued. India operated her Canberras in 2 wars against Pakistan, in 1965 and again in 1971. Indian Air Force Canberras struck targets across Pakistan, including night attacks on Mauripur Air Base outside Karachi during the December 1971 war. They suffered losses, particularly in 1965, but they also delivered substantial damage to Pakistani infrastructure. Indian Canberras went on to fly reconnaissance in the 1999 Kargil conflict, with 1 aircraft hit by a shoulder-fired infrared missile, but recovered safely. Final retirement of Indian Canberras came on May 11, 2007, almost exactly 50 years after they had entered Indian service in September 1957. The reconnaissance Canberras, particularly the British PR-9, accumulated a record that remains largely classified to this day. These aircraft, with their extended wings and uprated engines, could routinely operate above 50,000 feet, with a service ceiling reportedly beyond 60,000. Throughout the Cold War, PR-9s flew sensitive missions along the borders of the Warsaw Pact, photographing Soviet installations from international airspace at altitudes where Soviet fighters could not engage them. The British also penetrated Soviet airspace itself, with Canberras on more than one occasion. The most famous example was Operation Robin in late August 1953. Authorized personally by Winston Churchill, a No. 540 Squadron Canberra, fitted with a long focal-length oblique camera supplied by the Americans, took off from Giebelstadt in West Germany at night, photographed the Kapustin Yar missile test range at dawn, and recovered to Tabriz in Iran. She was hit by Soviet fighters but not lost. A Soviet MiG flown by Lieutenant Mikhail Shulga stalled out below her at around 50,000 feet. Operation Robin continued in some form until June 1956, when the U-2 became operational and took over the deepest penetration missions. Other Canberra missions remain only partially declassified. Royal Air Force No. 76 Squadron flew specially modified B-6s directly through the mushroom clouds of British hydrogen bomb tests over Christmas Island in 1957 and 1958, including the 3-megaton Grapple-Y detonation on April 28, 1958. The aircraft sampled fission products at altitudes between 42,000 and 54,000 feet, sometimes within minutes of the explosion. Several crews are known to have absorbed radiation doses well above the limits considered safe, even at the time. The Canberra's combat history extended into corners of the Cold War that have largely been forgotten. Ethiopian Air Force Canberras flew counter-insurgency missions against Eritrean separatists through the 1970s. Rhodesian Air Force Canberras, of No. 5 Squadron, played a central role in Operation Dingo, the cross-border raid into Mozambique on November 23 to 25, 1977, dropping approximately 1,200 Alpha cluster bombs over the guerrilla bases at Chimoio and Tembue. Argentine Canberras of Grupo 2 flew bombing missions during the Falklands War of 1982 from Trelew and Rio Gallegos, losing 2 aircraft in combat. The last Argentine aircraft shot down in the entire war was a Canberra, B-108, hit by a Sea Dart missile from HMS Cardiff while bombing Port Harriet House on June 13, 1982. Peruvian Canberras saw combat against Ecuador in the Chenepa War of 1995. By the 1980s, the Canberra had become genuinely strange. She was an aircraft from another era, with manual flight controls and analog instruments, and a cockpit layout designed before the term ergonomics had entered the engineering vocabulary. Her crews flew her wearing modern flight suits and helmets, surrounded by equipment that often dated to the 1950s. Visiting American pilots, more accustomed to the digital cockpits of the F-16 or the F-15, would climb into a Canberra cockpit and feel as though they had stepped into a museum. And yet she kept flying her missions. The Royal Air Force operated PR-9s from Marham in Norfolk with No. 39 Squadron into the 21st century. These aircraft, with their distinctive long pointed noses, their pressurized cockpits, and their immensely powerful Avon engines, continued to deliver high-altitude reconnaissance imagery that newer platforms could not match. They flew over Bosnia and Kosovo in the 1990s, including Operation Engadine in 1999. They flew over the First Congo War from Uganda in late 1996. They flew over Iraq during the no-fly zone enforcement under Operation Resonate. They flew over Afghanistan during Operation Veritas in late 2001 and again under Operation Herrick from January to June 2006. They flew over Somalia on Operation Ramson in 2002 and over Iraq again during Operation Telik in 2003 from Azraq in Jordan. The reason was simple. At extreme altitude, with a clean aerodynamic platform and powerful engines and a long camera bay, the Canberra produced reconnaissance imagery of exceptional quality. Satellites could photograph the ground from orbit, but their passes were predictable and their imaging windows narrow. Modern reconnaissance aircraft like the Lockheed U-2 could reach higher altitudes, but were enormously expensive to operate. The Canberra occupied a specific niche where her economics, her flexibility, and her image quality made her irreplaceable, so she was not replaced. By the early 2000s, the Royal Air Force was finally preparing to retire her, this time for real. The PR-9s were old, their airframes had accumulated thousands of flying hours. The cost of maintaining a small fleet of antique aircraft, with bespoke spare parts that had to be specially manufactured, was becoming difficult to justify. New satellite systems and unmanned aerial vehicles offered alternative ways of obtaining the imagery the Canberra had once provided uniquely. The end came in 3 stages. The Canberra's last operational sortie was flown on June 23, 2006, when 2 PR-9s of No. 39 Squadron, XH-131 and XH-135, returned to Royal Air Force Marham from Afghanistan via Seeb in Oman, escorted into Marham by Tornado GR-4s. The squadron's final display flight was performed on July 27, 2006, by squadron leader Terry Cairns at the Marham Families Day. No. 39 Squadron formally disbanded the next day, July 28, 2006, in a ceremonial flypast over Marham. The last Canberras to fly in Royal Air Force markings ferried themselves to Kemble for preservation on July 31, 2006. The aircraft that had first lifted off from Warton on May 13, 1949, dismissed as obsolete by 1958, replaced repeatedly throughout the 1960s and 70s and 80s, was at last truly gone from British service. She had served 57 years. To put that achievement into perspective requires looking at the aircraft against which she might be measured. The Supermarine Spitfire, perhaps the most famous British aircraft of all time, served in front-line operational roles from 1938 to 1954, the last sortie flown over Johor on April 1, 1954. That gave her about 16 years of front-line service. The Avro Lancaster served from 1942 to October 1956, perhaps 14 years in the Royal Air Force, slightly longer in foreign service. The Hawker Hurricane lasted barely a decade in front-line service. Even the legendary de Havilland Mosquito, the Wooden Wonder, served operationally for over 20 years from her first sortie in September 1941 to her last contract flights in May 1963. American comparisons are similar. The North American P-51 Mustang served operationally for about 15 years. The Republic F-84 Thunderjet for about 10. The North American F-86 Sabre for about 15 years in American service, somewhat longer in foreign air forces. The aircraft that come close to or exceed the Canberra's longevity are a small and specific group. The Boeing B-52 Stratofortress, first flown on April 15, 1952, remains in service with the United States Air Force in 2026 and is expected to continue flying into the 2050s. The Lockheed U-2 reconnaissance aircraft, first flown on August 1, 1955, is also still in service. These three aircraft, the B-52, the U-2, and the Canberra, together with the Lockheed C-130 Hercules transport, form an exceptional category of designs whose fundamental engineering proved so sound that they outlasted multiple generations of intended replacements. What distinguishes these aircraft from their contemporaries? The first answer is design margin. All four were built with structural and aerodynamic margins that exceeded the requirements of their original missions. They were stronger, more powerful, and more capable than the original specifications demanded. When circumstances changed and new missions emerged, the airframes could absorb the new requirements without fundamental redesign. Aircraft built closer to the limits of their original specifications could not adapt in the same way. The second answer is mission flexibility. None of these aircraft was optimized for a single narrow mission. The B-52 became a cruise missile carrier and a maritime patrol aircraft. The C-130 became a gunship, a tanker, and a special operations platform. The U-2 adopted ever more sophisticated sensor packages. The Canberra accepted roles ranging from bombing to reconnaissance to electronic warfare to atmospheric sampling, simply because Petter had designed an aerodynamically clean platform with substantial internal volume and excellent handling. The third answer is engine compatibility. All four aircraft used engines that themselves had long development paths. The B-52 has been re-engined and uprated repeatedly. The C-130 has used progressively improved versions of the Allison T-56. The U-2 received the General Electric F-118 engine in her later marks. The Canberra used progressively developed versions of the Avon. Aircraft tied to engines that ceased development tended to be retired with those engines. The fourth answer is what might be called operational humility. Each of these aircraft was designed by teams who understood what their aircraft was good at and did not try to make her do everything. The Canberra was never asked to be a fighter. The B-52 was never asked to be a fighter-bomber. By staying within their natural performance envelopes, these aircraft remained competent at what they did, while specialized supersonic and high-performance aircraft of the same era often discovered that their narrow optimizations did not match the actual demands of operational service. The contrast with the Canberra's contemporaries is instructive. The Avro 730, cancelled in 1957, was designed to fly at 3 times the speed of sound at 100,000 feet. Had she been built, she would have been an extraordinary technical achievement, but she would also have been brittle, expensive, and limited to a single, very specific mission profile. The supersonic North American B-70 Valkyrie, of which 2 prototypes were built, was a similarly extreme design that proved unsuited to the changing threat environment of the 1960s. Both aircraft, had they entered service, would almost certainly have been retired far sooner than the supposedly obsolete Canberra. Why was Britain the country that produced her? Why did this particular aircraft emerge from English Electric, a company that had never designed an original combat aircraft before, drawn by a small team in a converted building on a Preston back street? When so many larger and better-resourced manufacturers in larger and better-resourced countries failed to produce anything comparable? The answer, as so often in British aerospace history, lies in a combination of circumstances that produced unusual creative pressure. English Electric in 1944 was not really an original aircraft design company. The firm had spent the war years building 770 Handley Page Hamptons and over 2,000 Halifaxes under license at Preston and Samlesbury, but it had no original design pedigree of its own. When the company decided to enter the aircraft design business, it had to assemble a team almost from scratch. Petter, hired from Westland in 1944, brought with him a small group of engineers who had worked with him on the Whirlwind and the Welkin. These people knew each other intimately, with shared engineering instincts and a common vocabulary for solving problems. They were a tight team rather than a large bureaucracy. The Air Ministry specification was demanding but flexible. It did not prescribe how the aircraft should be designed, only what she should achieve. This gave Petter latitude that more bureaucratic procurement processes might have denied. He could pursue his unconventional approach, with the large wing and the absent defensive armament, without being told that such ideas violated established practice. British aerospace in the late 1940s operated under genuine resource constraints. The country had emerged from the war effectively bankrupt. There was no money for parallel programs or hedged bets. English Electric had to make their first design count. This pressure, paradoxically, encouraged commitment to a single coherent vision, rather than the compromised committee designs that more abundant funding sometimes produced. The British engineering culture of the period valued elegance. Petter's contemporaries included Sidney Cam at Hawker, Reginald Mitchell's successors at Supermarine, George Carter at Gloucester, and a generation of designers who saw aerodynamic cleanliness as a moral as well as a practical virtue. An aircraft that did her job with minimum fuss, minimum weight, and minimum complexity was considered superior to one that achieved the same result through brute force. Finally, there was the Avon engine. Rolls-Royce had, by 1947, produced what was probably the finest jet engine in the world. The Avon's combination of thrust, reliability, and development potential gave Petter a power source that simply did not exist in other countries at the time. American jet engines of the same era, the General Electric J47 and the Westinghouse J40, were either less powerful or less reliable. Soviet engines were derived from 25 examples of the Rolls-Royce Nene, sold to the Soviet Union by Sir Stafford Cripps as president of the Board of Trade in 1946 and 1947, but Moscow had not yet developed engines of comparable sophistication. The Canberra's performance owed an enormous debt to the engine that powered her, and that engine was a uniquely British achievement. These factors converged in a moment of creative possibility that did not last. By the late 1950s, English Electric had been absorbed into the British Aircraft Corporation. Petter had moved to Folland. The small, dedicated teams of the immediate post-war period gave way to larger consortium structures that produced different kinds of aircraft. The Canberra was, in this sense, a product of a specific historical moment that could not be repeated. What endures is the aircraft herself, and the lesson she taught. Some Canberras still fly today, more than 77 years after that first prototype lifted off from Warton. The National Aeronautics and Space Administration has long operated a small fleet of WB-57F aircraft from Ellington Field at Houston, Texas, conducting high-altitude atmospheric research and serving as test platforms for various sensors and equipment. These aircraft were rebuilt by General Dynamics at Fort Worth in the mid-1960s on B-57B and B-57D fuselages from the previous decade. Fitted with extended 122-foot wings and turbofan engines, and they routinely operate above 60,000 feet. The fleet currently consists of 3 airframes, N926NA, N927NA, and N928NA. In late January 2026, N927NA made a gear-up landing at Ellington during a training exercise. As of April 2026, the program remains active, and the surviving airframes are returning to flight status. The basic Canberra design, in other words, is still on duty 77 years after its first flight. In museums around the world, restored Canberras stand as witnesses to what she was. The Royal Air Force Museum at Hendon has one. The Imperial War Museum at Duxford has another. The Australian War Memorial in Canberra, the city after which the aircraft was named, displays one of the Australian-built versions. The London to Christchurch race winner, PR3WE139, sits at the Royal Air Force Museum, still wearing her record-breakers livery. Walking around these aircraft, looking at their elegant lines and their immense wings and their clean fuselages, it is possible to understand at a glance why Beamont answered Petter the way he did on Friday the 13th of May. The Canberra is a beautiful aircraft, and her beauty is functional. Every line on her serves a purpose. Nothing is decorative. The aircraft that they laughed at as ancient, that they dismissed as obsolete, that they tried to replace half a dozen times across half a dozen decades, outlasted every laugh and every dismissal and every replacement program. She served 3 generations of aircrew. She fought in every major conflict of the Cold War in some role or another. She gathered intelligence that helped win the long confrontation with the Soviet Union. She trained pilots, towed targets, dropped bombs, photographed installations, sampled the atmosphere, and tested equipment. She did everything that was asked of her, and she kept doing it long after everyone had stopped expecting her to. The deeper lesson of her story extends beyond aviation. It speaks to a truth about how excellence actually works in any technical domain. Spectacular performance figures attract attention but rarely produce longevity. Narrow optimization generates impressive demonstrations but tends to fail when circumstances change. Balanced design, structural margin, and a humble respect for the limits of what is possible produce systems that serve for decades, while their flashier rivals are quietly forgotten. Teddy Petter's Canberra was the supreme example of this principle in 20th century military aviation. She was never the fastest, never the highest, never the most heavily armed, never the most technologically advanced. She was simply and precisely the most balanced. And balance, it turned out, was what mattered most. They laughed at her ancient lines, and she served 57 years. The ones who laughed are long retired. The Canberra still flies.